Hello and welcome to Unstress Health. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Well, today's subject is evidence-based medicine, and that term is one that you will often hear prefacing any health advice that you get. Yes, this advice is evidence-based, and your doctor will say to you, yes, this treatment is evidence-based, and the public health officials will say, this treatment, a policy is evidence-based. And to the uninitiated, that would seem very reassuring. But to anybody that's taken a slightly deeper dive into that term, you will know that it is not quite as straightforward as it sounds. Another aspect to it is when you ask your medical practitioner for X, Y, or Z, and they say, oh, there's no evidence to support that, which implies that they have read all the evidence that there is. And anybody who has taken a deeper dive into that will know that that is just simply not possible. It would be better for that practitioner to simply be honest and say, I'm not aware of any evidence to support that. And that would be an honest answer. But evidence-based medicine is an issue. And one of the most cited medical health practitioners in the world, Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford University, has alerted us to the fact that there is difficulty in distinguishing between evidence-based medicine and evidence-based marketing. And that is very much the topic of today. What is evidence-based medicine? What are some of the challenges, some of the biases, some of the pitfalls, and what can we do about it? How can we approach it? But in order to solve a problem, it always helps to know whether there is a problem, what that problem is. And this is a story, particularly for a busy health practitioner, that is very easy to miss, but once you hear it, very difficult to ignore. My guest today is Dr. Lewis Ehrlich. Now, Lewis is the principal of the Sydney Holistic Dental Centre, a practice that I founded over 40 years ago with my brother, Dr. Joshua Ehrlich. He is co-principal there with Dr. Yin Teo and Dr. Craig Wilson. And it is a patient-centred practice, and it has dealt with the issues of evidence-based for our entire professional life. And we've kept a very open mind about it. Now, this is actually a two-part podcast because in this first part, I talked to Lewis about evidence-based medicine. The reason I do is not only because he is a dentist in a holistic practice, but when the pandemic arose and there was a great deal of controversy about it, what evidence was, Lewis decided to do a degree at Oxford University, the home of evidence-based medicine. This is where the fathers, if you like, of the Cochrane collaboration, which was put together to give some weight, give some meat behind what evidence-based really was about. The heads of the Department of Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford were his teachers, and I was so impressed with him undertaking such a study that I wanted to get him on to share his insights and all that he has learnt along the way. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Dr. Lewis Earle. Welcome back to the show, Lewis.
Thanks, Uncle Ron. Good to be back.
You can just call me Ron for this podcast. Listen, we're talking today about evidence-based medicine, and it's a word that or an expression that many doctors use, and it gives them peace of mind, I guess, and many patients listen to and feel reassured by. But I think we both know that it's not everything that it's cracked up to be. We're going to cover some of those challenges. I wondered if we might just start with what exactly is evidence-based medicine. How was it originally conceived?
Yeah, so evidence-based medicine is basically giving a framework for making clinical decisions. So, making them based on evidence that's there or not there, and that's an important distinction. The purpose of evidence-based medicine is to actually make sure that you're doing decisions in your practice that are actually based on evidence. And it's important to realize that it's flung about as a term, but a lot of people don't actually know what that means. And I can speak from personal experience because in dental school and in my Bachelor of Science degree, and I've studied for now 21 years, I still, after all those years, I still didn't really know how to analyze scientific literature, and I think a lot of people, speaking to people at Oxford, they actually don't know too much about it. Medical doctors that I was there with neurosurgeons, oncologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, you name it, everyone was in the classroom. And we all asked the question to each other, how much work did you do in medicine or in dentistry or in any other field that they were involved in on analysing rigorously the data that was presented? And it wasn't very much at all.
Mhm.
So then the term evidence-based medicine, or there's no evidence to support that, or there is evidence to support that, is flung about a lot with health practitioners. And I think there's a bit of a issue throwing terms out like that, because it's one thing to say that, but it's another thing to actually understand how to critique studies, which a lot of people aren't armed with, and I was one of those people. So that's why I went and did it.
Yes, well, we're going to dive into a bit more of the detail and answer some of those challenges, because it is a word that's bandied around. It's almost like a doctor. Once the doctor says, "Oh, this is evidence-based," they feel justified to continue. And another common term is, well, there's no evidence to support, and that would suggest that they have read all the evidence that there is there. And I think we both know that it takes around 600 hours a week to keep up with all of the evidence. So that's not a real statement in and of itself. But you chose, and you've acknowledged the fact that you've been in practice, you've been studying now for over 20 years, and you weren't well placed to understand what it actually meant. Before we dive into it, tell us a bit about what you did and why you did it.
Yeah, so I recognize that a lot of scientific research studies that you would read, I actually didn't have any skill set specifically to go and read it and go, is this good data? Is this accurate data? Are the findings relevant? Can you throw them out? Is the statistics solid? Is it just basically good research? At the end of the day, it's like, if somebody brings you a dental product, for example, and they say this is the latest and greatest and you should adopt it because XYZ, you actually have to know whether or not that's true. And it doesn't matter if you're a cardiologist, a dentist. If you don't have the skill set, you can't analyze it, and you can't pass that on to your patients. So I feel more confident in my practice now, that having gained in these skills, that I can actually question what I do, to a level that I would assume is higher than most, and therefore I can get better health outcomes based on knowing what to analyze. So I think that it's a good thing for practitioners to do. But even within that, there's still huge flaws within the evidence-based system as well. And I thought that Oxford, one of the reasons why I chose Oxford, was that was the birthplace of evidence-based medicine. And the theme through all my professors was that they weren't afraid to rip studies to shreds and say, this is not great evidence. This is good evidence. And even if it meant that it didn't hold the university in necessarily good stead, so they were willing to critique themselves to a really high standard. And they kind of knew what they were there for. They knew that they were trying to advance science, as opposed to, allowing industry influence, or, the reputation of the university to be maintained at a really high level. I thought that they were really thorough, as unbiased as possible. And it was just a really brilliant experience on that front. And speaking of bias, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. There's a catalogue of bias that the University of Oxford have established. It's an ongoing document, and they've got about 48 different types of biases that can be found within scientific research. So at the University of Oxford, they've found 48 biases that can sway data and sway the evidence and the results of evidence. So, for example, one is all's well bias. So that's where positive outcomes are more likely to be published as opposed to negative outcomes. So if it's positive, they'll bias it towards being published, and more data comes out on that particular topic because people love to read positive results as opposed to negative results. We know in research that negative results are less likely to be published. So there's one such bias. And then there's another one called hot stuff bias, which is where the latest and greatest fad is always sort of published in positive terms, and there's just almost this raft of research on the newest, coolest thing. You know, it might be microbiome testing, or it might be some sort of new amazing test that establishes whether you can pick up a disease early or not. You know, like this is like hot stuff in the media, so they're more likely to get a lot of airtime and almost sway data in the studies to make sure that that's pumped out and in accordance with what's come before it. So there's 48 different types of biases that they've established, and I think that shows that they're ahead of the game, where you can read a paper, use the catalogue of bias. They've got examples, and when I'm reading a paper, I would actually just go through and go, oh, that's bias in that sense, that's bias in that sense, that's bias in that sense, and therefore I'm less likely to really trust that evidence if a lot of those biases were found in those papers.
I mean, another bias must be who's paying for the research. That's a big bias. In terms of healthcare, medicine, what percentage of research is funded by the pharmaceutical industry?
The TGA, for example, that's the Australian equivalent of the FDA.
That's the Therapeutic Goods Association as opposed to the Food and Drug Administration in America, yeah.
Yeah, 96% of funding comes from industry. So that's a huge number.
Yes.
But I think that would surprise people. But I think, to play devil's advocate to that, there's two things to mention. Obviously, it's not good that the tentacles of, you know, private enterprise have entered science, right? So that's a huge problem. But on the flip side, you have to realize that performing studies is extremely expensive. And a lot of universities don't have the backing to constantly pump out the amount of research that's necessary to keep up the pace with medical science and all its advances. So there are industry-sponsored studies that we've read that are quite solid, you know, but we've needed a private enterprise to actually provide the resources to conduct studies. So what I'm saying is, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that, yes, there's huge influence, which is a problem that you need to recognize. But on the flip side to that, you sometimes need industry money in order to conduct the studies, to get the information out there and get advancements out there. So, for example, like for a study to make its way into recommendations, that can take up to 17 years. So you can read medical guidelines on, you know, how to eat a healthy diet or what to do for heart health. Now that's a minefield in and of itself, because we can analyze diets and what's heart healthy and all these sorts of things. The cows come home. The point I'm trying to make is that it takes 17 years for that to become recommendations. So in order to speed up the pace at which recommendations are actually delivered to patients with the latest and greatest, you actually need to be conducting a lot of studies. So to play a sort of balanced argument here, it's a problem that 96% of industry, you know, funding of the TGA is there, but equally you need some sort of pumping in of financial resources to get studies out that can speed up science and advancement. So there's studies that I've read where I'm like, okay, that industry influence, you can see it clear as day, and it's a problem and it's bias, and you can tell that they're trying to get out positive information so that they make money for their shareholders. But equally, I've read studies that have been sponsored by industry that have said, actually, this doesn't work. This isn't good. So what I would say to people is that there's nuance, and not to say, okay, because there's industry sponsor of this study, we need to just throw it out. Okay, because you still have to analyze what's within the paper, and you can tear it to shreds and find that actually it's a solid paper that can be used. So I think there's nuance that people need to understand, because we're very black and white in today's society. We're very polarized.
Yes.
And so I would exercise caution with that, because there are some reasons why they're involved,
Yeah.
which can be positive.
Well, I admire your that nuance, and clearly, having done the course and been exposed to the reality, to hear you speak in such nuanced terms is very reassuring. However, I would just add that if a pharmaceutical industry is funding a university to do studies, and one of the 48 biases or two of the 48 biases are all's well, if they funded 20 of those studies and 15 of them were negative but 5 were positive, it's very likely that the 15 that were negative may not find their way into the literature as quickly as the 5 that were positive, particularly if they added another bias, hot stuff, to that. Then you've got a double bias there, which is an incentive. And the university would know, hey, look, we got a positive result here, and we're going to get more funding. So we're really on a little bit of a something here. Let's continue this relationship. And even better, if the regulatory body is funded by the industry, that's a really neat way of speeding approvals up, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. So you're correct. The data does show that positive studies are far more likely to be published, like I said earlier.
Hmm.
And it is a little bit of a concern when you've got the people that are meant to be looking out for, these drug companies, that they're doing the right thing. They're pumping in so much money into the people that are meant to be guiding that. That's a massive conflict of interest. But also, that's another reason why I was really happy with Oxford, is that they're one of the leading universities that are getting actually out a conflict of interest database, where, back in the day it was very easy to kind of hide your conflicts of interest. But they're really trying to aim for as much transparency as possible, and they've created a database where you can actually analyze the extent to which there is conflict of interest in studies. So you have to actually put it into a database now. So that's driven in a large part due to Oxford.
What another thing that I think is worth mentioning, because you mentioned, 21 years of studying, you weren't really well equipped to do it. You were in a cohort of students at Oxford that covered almost every medical specialty: cardiologists, psychiatrists, doctors, dentists, whatever. I think it's fair to say that doctors who look at the literature will typically tick 2 boxes. Number one, if it's published in a refereed journal, that to them is good enough, and that constitutes evidence-based as far as they're concerned. Or if they want to be really thorough, they'll read the abstract, and that would account for probably 95% of practitioners' approach to evidence-based medicine. But an article in a refereed journal involves much more than that. Can you just run us through, a typical article in a research? What do they publish? What's wrong with just looking at an abstract or knowing that it's published in a journal? Do I need to know any more than that?
Yeah, so I think the first point you raised there, Ron, is that there's a difference between reference-based medicine and evidence-based medicine. So a lot of I have to again show nuance here. So as a health practitioner, we all know how under the pump we are. Okay, and there's an absolute mountain of evidence, right?
Yep.
So people need to spend time with their family. They need to see, all these different patients. They have to treat all these, people day to day. And so then to go and trawl through the research without a skill set to do so, like I mentioned, it's really difficult. So are many people going to put in that effort? And the answer is likely no. So that's obviously a problem for patient outcomes, but understandable. We've all been there. It's not like I'm 24/7 either. So you have to give people a little bit of a pass on that front, So the difference between reference-based medicine and evidence-based medicine is that if I have, also speaks to bias, if I have an idea of what I want to say or do or promote, then I'm going to trawl the evidence and I'm going to find a reference that supports my point of view. That is not the way to do science and practice, a particular health profession. What it should be is, here's the question I want answered. I'm going to go through the research, analyze the research to a really high standard with the skill set that I've acquired, and I will then make an informed decision, an evidence-informed decision, rather than, and you see it all over social media, what I'm talking about. This is my point of view. I've found a way of thinking. I am going to find a reference, a result in an abstract, not in a paper, not going to go to the lengths of reading the actual paper. I'm going to find an abstract that supports my argument. I'm going to put up a social media post. I'm going to tell all my patients. I'm going to tell all my family. That's the way a lot of people operate. And I think it's problematic because it creates this immense division in society, and it gets rid of the nuance within it. So, I've been to many doctors that say there's no evidence to support that, or that's not right, or the science is clear on that. And then the flip side to that is that people don't even look at evidence. The other side of the fence is just like, this is what I believe, this is what I know. And, you get headstrong patients that come in and go, I don't care how much study you've done. I don't care how much experience you have. This is what I believe. And each to their own, no problem. But they're two sides to the spectrum. And so I suppose to answer the next part of your question is, yes, there's different journals that have what we call a higher impact factor. So, Cochrane Review, British Medical Journal, these are the New England Journal of Medicine. These ones are a higher impact. There's more rigor, more peer reviewing, etc. Now, that's not to say that there's not issues with them. Just because it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine doesn't mean a paper hasn't ever been retracted. So there's several examples of those that we discussed in our course where the New England Journal of Medicine was heavily criticized in certain aspects, on certain topics, on certain science that we'd read in class and tear it apart. So just because it's a high impact journal doesn't necessarily mean that it's without flaws, but it means that it's been more rigorously looked at by people that are hopefully as unbiased as possible. But this notion that you can just read a paper and say, oh, it's in this high impact journal, therefore I'm going to read the abstract and tell everybody as if it's gospel, is not necessarily the smart thing to do, because even those papers need to be rigorously studied. Study design and the amount of people that have been in it. What were the results? What are the statistical analyses? Have people manipulated the statistics within it? How many studies were compiled in a systematic review? What were the quality of those studies? What were the conflicts of interest within those studies? There's about a million different things you can look at within a paper. And so this is why it's frustrating when I hear there's no evidence to support that. That's a classic one, that you'll hear from a practitioner, because it's impossible to troll through all the research. And two, even within the ones that are published, there are still many ways in which you can critique that and say that it's not necessarily accurate. But there are some times where we actually need to use what's available to guide our clinical decisions as well. So again, nuance. Sometimes things aren't studied as rigorously, or as, I suppose, the amount of papers on a particular topic aren't there for certain topics. Everything that's ever been discovered once was not discovered. And so there's a point at which, there's not a lot of data on things. And so you have to build on evidence over time, which is why you'll hear at the end of it, more studies are needed, which is good. You know?
I mean, often within a paper, and of course, the reason people go through and just read the abstract is it's usually 1 or 2 paragraphs and it's quick and easy to read,
Yeah,
because an article is typically starts with a hypothesis or a discussion about what they're trying to do in this study. Then it goes through the methodology of, we used 1,000 patients, we randomized control, we did this, we did that. And then the next one is about statistics, what we found, the results,
yeah,
and how we analyzed them. And here is the conclusion. And the conclusion often informs the abstract. That's a typical study. But even within a study, the results, the statistics could say one thing, and it's not unusual for a conclusion to draw a different conclusion than what their own results showed. That happens too, doesn't it?
yeah, it does. And it's a minefield with statistics as well, because statistics are basically an analysis on whether something is more likely to be true or not. Like almost like something didn't happen by chance. That brings sort of rigor and strength to a paper. But even within that, there are really brilliant people out there that can bend statistics to find a result that they want to see.
Hmm.
There's
Sort of deliver an all's well result so they can keep getting funding to keep the machine of research going.
correct, or the flip side to that is that the statistics is poor due to mistakes, and then somebody who's really good at analyzing statistics actually goes, that's really incorrect statistical analysis, and here's the true result. So it
Yeah.
can be deliberate, or it can be mistakes, or it can be completely accurate. That's also true.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. One of the really fascinating parts of reading a bit of research is, does the abstract actually match the actual paper? Because there's sometimes where the title of the paper will say this is what we're looking for. The abstract will say something different to what's in the paper as well. So, there's this whole thing called a PICO, which is population intervention, a comparator, and then an outcome. So they have to match, the abstract has to match what's in the paper in that PICO, right?
Mhm.
So oftentimes we had ones in class where those didn't match up at all. You would read the title, the abstract, and then in the first paragraph, they started talking about something completely different. So then you throw that paper away, you don't even bother, right? So that everything has to match. So yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these topics that you could study for your whole life and you would never like truly master it. It's extremely complex and nuanced, but people love simplicity, and I think that butts heads because people want to know for sure that something is true or not. And the reality is that there's a huge amount of grey area within science, which is kind of a good thing because it keeps people curious to find out answers if their heart's in the right place, which is good.
Now, Lou, I know there's another aspect that is often used in the world of evidence-based marketing, and that is the difference between a relative and absolute risk. Like I know that, for example, statins reduce the risk of heart attack or heart disease by 36%, and that's really impressive. Who wouldn't do something like that? And we need to understand the difference between relative and absolute risk. Can you just explain that one to us?
Yeah, so really important because a lot of the articles in the media will often use relative risk, and people go, "Wow, that's an amazing result." So, for example, if you took a new Alzheimer's drug and it reduced the risk of Alzheimer's by 50%, you would read that in an article and go, "Wow, 50%, that's huge. What a reduction." But if you use absolute risk and you found that the the actual risk went from one in 1,000, got to two in a thousand, the difference is 50%. So the absolute risk is tiny, 1 in 1,000 to 2 in 1,000, but the relative risk of that is 50%. You'd go, oh my God, this is incredible. But the reality is that it barely moves the needle, right? And we know that even, Alzheimer's drugs, cancer drugs, COVID vaccines, often what's reported in the media is actually relative risk, which often inflates their efficacy.
Yeah, yeah, and that is so often used in selling of a drug, because to a busy practitioner, if you can reduce the risk of dementia by 50%, who wouldn't do that?
Yeah, and that credit to Oxford as well on that, because in class we went through about 10 newspaper articles in class together with all the health practitioners in the one classroom, and we analysed what the newspaper article said. We pulled up the paper that it was based on, and what we found is almost exclusively that it was never nearly as effective as what was written in the media. So that's just something for people to keep in mind.
The other one that I have heard now, Ross Walker has talked about on this program before as well, is number needed to treat.
Um,
Can you explain that one to us?
Number needed to treat. Yeah. So basically, how would I put this in real simple terms? So basically, the amount of people you need to treat to get the result that you need. So, if you give somebody a drug, one person a drug, and you get a great result, that's obviously a good number needed to treat. But if you have to give people 100,000, you have to give 100,000 people this particular drug and then you get a result, the number needed to treat is obviously huge, and therefore the drug isn't that effective. So that's how you would explain that. So the number needed to treat, if I gave you, Ron, a drug and said this will reduce your risk of heart disease significantly, and it did do that after one, but if I gave it to 100,000 people and none of them worked until the 100,000th person, then obviously you need to treat a lot of people to get the result. So not as effective.
Reproducibility is another important part of research, isn't it? And there is a little bit of a problem with reproducibility in the healthcare industry, isn't there?
Yeah, so Nature, speaking of high impact journals, Nature is a high impact journal, very well respected. They came up with a paper that showed, so reproducibility is essentially, the ability to reproduce results. So therefore it builds confidence to know that those results are actually more likely to be true than not. And so Nature Nature did a study and showed that 70% of scientists couldn't reproduce the study results of other scientists in their analysis, and 50% of scientists couldn't reproduce the results of their own research when done again.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this comes back to, I mean, it's great. I know there is a guy, a professor at Stanford University, John Ioannidis,
Yeah.
who I'd love to get on as a guest. That's my next thing after you, Lou.
I'd love to listen to that.
Well, just to put this in perspective for our listener, when you write an article in a scientific journal and it gets referenced, that's called a citation. And if you get a couple of hundred or even a couple of thousand citations, you are doing very well. 10,000 citations is amazing. John Ioannidis has been cited over 200,000 times, and he alerted us, the medical health community, many years ago, to the fact that there is a very difficult to tell the difference between evidence-based medicine and evidence-based marketing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it comes back to a little bit of the tentacles of industry getting into science and then swaying results. I think that if you want to promote a new medical product, a new pharmaceutical, a new supplement, even, because let's not forget the nutraceutical industry is not immune to bias as well, even though it's considered more quote unquote natural.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, again, it's one of those things where there's huge amounts of biases. Positive results are more likely to be published than negative ones. But like I also said, there are some good studies,
Okay.
based on industry as well. So, I mean, look, I think that you could definitely find huge amounts of papers that are evidence-based marketing.
Yeah, I think I know we've been talking about this within our family, and Annie, my wife, works at University of Technology Sydney, and she prefers the term evidence informed, which is, I think, alludes more to your nuance approach. There are some what are I mean, a lot of practitioners are not going to go off and do a 1-year program at Oxford that you've done, or 18-month program at Oxford that you've done on
Mm.
evidence-based medicine. What are some red flags that practitioners and patients should look out for when evaluating these kind of things? What would you suggest, knowing what you know now and knowing that a lot of practitioners aren't going to do what you've done?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing to say is that there's a huge amount of resources out there that don't necessarily mean you have to go off and study, for multiple years doing this sort of course. So I mean, just there's so many podcasts, for example, at the moment where they're actually doing really great interviews that are showing you how to analyze data. So I know, like, for example, Peter Attia has a big podcast called The Drive. He's had one back in 2023 where he sits down with somebody and they actually go through how to analyze research at a high level. So you could, that's an hour and a half or 2 hour podcast that can give you an idea. There's so many Substack people to follow.
Who are you following though?
I follow Dr. Vinay Prasad.
Mm-hmm.
He's an American oncologist that really understands how to dig into the data and simplify it for people.
Mm-hmm.
Very statistically sound as well. The head of Oxford evidence-based medicine is a guy called Carl Hennigan, and he has a Substack called Trust the Evidence, and they just go through examples of, studies or topics that say one thing and they might say something different, and they show you how to actually get to that point. So that can give you a more sort of nuanced, balanced approach as opposed to taking something as gospel. So there are a few. But yeah, just in terms of paper analysis itself, you're obviously looking at sample size, you're looking at study design, you're looking at whether or not the statistics are sound. That's a whole another topic. The quality of research put into a systematic review, like even within a study, you still have to go and look at the studies within the studies that they've quoted. So that can be a bit of a minefield as well. How much bias is in it? Like all that catalogue of bias that I talked about earlier, you can go and see if there's signs of those things popping up in a paper, a whole range of things. But I think that those resources that I mentioned are actually a really good thing for health practitioners to go and listen to and subscribe to and just show an interest in, because you'll get better health outcomes and provide better advice.
We'll have links to those in our show notes. I'm just coming back to the quality of research, because this is another issue within evidence-based medicine, that we've come to the point where a double-blind randomized controlled trial is seen as the gold standard for medical research.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it might be worth reminding our listener of what a double-blind randomized controlled trial is, firstly.
Mm.
But in fact, let's do that. What is? I mean, is that true? What are the levels of standards of research from randomized control to observational, longitudinal? I don't even know what some of those mean. Can you just give us a little bit of a short 101?
Yeah, so like there's just a pyramid of a hierarchy of evidence essentially. So, a systematic review, meta-analysis is a compilation of a whole range of studies, and then the really rigorous ones are placed into the studies themselves, the study itself, and only the ones that are really rigorous get included, and then they do a full statistical analysis. That's what a meta-analysis is. It's the statistical side of things, but a systematic review is a compilation of the really rigorous papers that have made it into that to form a totality of evidence that suggests that a result is true or not. So that's like the gold standard. Obviously, a randomized control trial is a single study. So a systematic review is a compilation of all those studies. Then the next level is obviously randomized control, double blind. So you got two groups compared to each other. One's blinded, they don't know that they're getting an intervention, versus another group that get a placebo, for example. And then the results are analysed and recommendations based off that. And then you get into observational studies, where
And the double blind, Lou, is referencing the fact that not only is the patient blinded to what they're receiving, but so is the practitioner.
yeah,
Is that right?
the researcher is blinded
Is
as well.
blind as well. So that's the
There's no bias and influence that could be, they might not, if the researcher's not blinded, they could, potentially change things to guide the results to what they want. So it's obviously far better if both the person and the researcher is blinded, because it's more likely to minimize bias.
And just to remind our listener too about placebo typically would be something totally inert
Yeah.
that wouldn't elicit any kind of reaction at all. So you can't get, it's not like you give the same, a different drug as the placebo, like you're doing antidepressants. You're giving the new antidepressant to one patient and an old antidepressant to another patient. That's not a placebo. A placebo would be
A
a
sugar
sugar
pill.
or
Yeah.
something that's not going to have any effect at all.
Yeah, like say you wanted, like just off the top of my head, say you wanted to treat PTSD on military veterans, and you give someone, medical grade MDMA, and you give somebody else a sugar pill, and that's obviously going to build a lot of rigor into the data, because you're not comparing, like for
Yeah.
like.
And the same would be true, say, I know this is a contentious issue, but vaccinations too. If you were trying to show that a vaccine was effective and safe, you would compare that vaccine to a sugar pill or a salt injection that had no effect at all. That would be a gold standard to establish the safety of a vaccine. That'd be right too, wouldn't
Yeah, correct.
yeah, we could spend a whole hour talking about that one, but that's a subject for another podcast. What about, look, I mean, there's a lot of issues here, and I love the fact that you, having studied as much as you have taken this very nuanced approach. I'm very proud of you, Lou. It's not the way I would approach things, but then, you're more mature about this than I am, clearly. Look, I also know that the practice that we are part of, you are part of, you're now the principal of, talks about a patient-centered approach. If the current model of evidence-based medicine is compromised, and I think, you can be as nuanced as you like, it is compromised, what does a more trustworthy patient-centered model look like? How do we get there? What do you think?
Yeah, I've been asked this a few times. It's a really tricky one. I think one thing is to definitely educate as many people to a deeper level that are health practitioners. Like, I think it has to be more deeply taught in their degree, because you have to be able to analyze things at a deeper level, because the waters are getting so murky, in terms of influence, bias, study design, etc. Particularly, I suppose, with AI coming as well, it's going to just be, the research will just be coming out left, right, and center. I think that we need to reduce the amount of industry influence in research and try and build more philanthropic resource availability. Like, there's a lot of hugely wealthy people that could do some really amazing things by just letting universities conduct their own studies and try and minimize the amount of bias that's within it. I think I'd love to see more negative results come out on things. But I think that at the moment, like 96% of TGA funding coming from industry, like that's like 4% is not like that. It's not 50-50. It's hugely skewed. So, like I said, there are advantages of having industry, but like we just need to get more neutral unbiased funding, as opposed to the funding being, given by people that need to get a result so that they can keep shareholders happy. I think, non-for-profit is idealistic, but also helps science a lot,
Yeah. Lou, I want to thank you for joining us today, sharing your knowledge and wisdom. I know we're going to get you back very soon, in fact, in next week's episode, where we're going to talk about a very contentious and controversial issue in dentistry on root canal treatments. And I think this was a good introduction to that next episode. I'll have links to a lot of the resources you've suggested, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ron. Appreciate it.
Well, it's complicated, isn't it? It's nuanced. And I love the fact that Lewis, having studied all of that, has kept a very open mind and realizes and explains how nuanced it is. There are 48 different categories of bias that can influence a work, how it's funded. Is it all's well? Is it hot stuff that will make the news? Will it continue the funding to be channeled into research, et cetera, et cetera? And look, at the end of the day, this is a story that I've been following since my very early days in dentistry, when I was parroting what I had been taught. And in that particular case at university, what I had been taught was that mercury is locked into a silver amalgam filling. 50% of it is mercury, but don't worry, it's locked in. And that's what I was taught. But actually, that is not true. And fluoride, water fluoridation is a great thing, and we could talk about that. I've done other topics on that. And if you've read my book, you'll know my position on that. But it's nuanced. The same goes for a whole range of things. So I've been following this story for a long time now. It's interesting that Lewis mentioned some of the referee journals and the Cochrane collaboration, because one of those referee journals that he mentioned, the New England Journal of Medicine, some 20 odd years ago, the editors started to write editorials which were somewhat critical of Big Pharma's influence on healthcare. And she was dismissed from that journal and then went on to write a book called The Truth About Drug Companies and How They Deceive Us. One of the founders of the Cochrane collaboration, Danish physician, Professor Peter Gertsch. He's a physician, an epidemiologist, a researcher. He was one of the founders of the Cochrane collaboration, and 10 years ago published a book called Deadly Medicines and Organised Crime: How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare. And if you're following the food story about how public health policies are set, about the food pyramids and about the low-fat diet and the demonization of animal products, one needs to look no further than big food for the influence there and the influence they have on all levels of healthcare. So this is a very, very big story, and I think it's important to understand the nuances and the challenges involved. And where does that leave us as a listener, as a member of the public? Well, you have to take control of your own health and stick to some very basic things. I believe that as the world we live in becomes increasingly more complicated, so many of the solutions are remarkably simple, they're cheap, they're accessible, they're sustainable, and what's more, they are effective. That's for the vast majority. Now, if you are then diagnosed with a condition, well, you need to take a step back and take stock and do some exploring that yourself and go to trusted sources. And that's what I hope this podcast is about. That's what I know Unstress Health is about. And I invite you to join that community. Until next time, and we will be getting Dr. Lewis back next week to talk about another very contentious issue: root canal treatments. Now, if you have had any, may or may not be familiar with it, but it is a contentious issue. Again, it's nuanced, and I'll invite you to join me for that. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. Feeling stressed, overwhelmed? It's time to unstress your life. Join the Unstress Health community and transform stress into strength. Build mental fitness, from self-sabotage to self-mastery. And together, let's not just survive, but thrive. Expert-led courses, curated podcasts, like-minded community and support, and much more. Visit unstresshealth.com today. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.